The realisation that more South Africans are poorer than previously thought comes as the world realises that the rich are getting richer and inequality is growing worse. According to projections, the richest 1% of the world's population will soon own 50% of the wealth. At home, an article by political analyst Friedman caught our eye. He says South Africans need new thinking to address the gap between the rich and the rest. Friedman is the director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy. He joins us in studio now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So looking at these new poor stats, the moving of the poverty line, I guess a big argument has always been that there will be capitalism, inequality will grow. Some people will get stinking rich at the top, but even those at the bottom will eventually move up. So poverty will decrease and growth will trickle down. Does this put paid to that?
Well, I think that the questions about whether it was ever true, I mean, if you look at the development of those societies which have dealt with poverty, yes, you may go through a very early stage where inequality widens. But after a while, growth is achieved by narrowing inequality, because as you create more opportunities for poor and working people, the more they participate in the economy, the more the economy grows. So this idea that we can only grow economies by making sure that there are masses of poor people and that inequality grows is simply not true. It simply doesn't describe the way real economies grow. And so by allowing high levels of inequality, we're actually decreasing our chances of economic growth.
Don't we have models here, the Nordic countries, that have allowed the free market on one hand, but have created these safety nets on the other? And those are pretty equal societies. So everyone is acting like this is a new problem. But why aren't we looking to that model and saying, let's go that route?
Well, I think we're not looking at that model because an ideology has grown up which is very extreme, which says that unless we have totally free markets, we can't grow. And as you point out, that's not correct. I mean, the obvious example is the Nordic countries, which have the highest level standards of living in the world and the lowest level of inequality. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because of government policies. Now, there are some people who argue that we're not rich enough to have those sorts of policies. Well, there are two answers to that. The first answer is they weren't rich either when they started those policies. The second answer is, that even if you can't afford the generous welfare that they have in the Scandinavian countries, we can do a lot better than we are at the moment. And that's what the thinking around the world is about at the moment. And this is not thinking among radical economists. This is thinking among hedge fund managers, among senior central bankers, among very mainstream figures in the world economy who are realizing that we have a very serious problem.
And you're quite critical of the media, and I'd just like to challenge you on that, because I mean, Thomas Piketty's book came out, and we know media often bias towards business, but I think this book, that this issue has received unprecedented attention.
Well, you may have been giving it unprecedented attention. I mean, I listen to radio a lot, I read newspapers, I watch television. Yes, in niche programs like yours perhaps, but I mean, in the mainstream, this hasn't been given the attention that it should have. And really, I've listened to panel discussions on the economy, quite mainstream panel discussions where you have three radical free market economists debating each other. We're not talking about socialism here. We're talking about a balance. We're talking about people who recognize that in any functioning market economy, you need a balance, that for business to grow, other people have to do better as well. And that voice is not heard to the extent that it should.
Okay, so inclusive growth, that's what we want to achieve. You say that the arguments on either side are pretty stale. So what's the new idea? What's your idea? How do we achieve inclusive growth?
There are all sorts of new ideas. Look, the big idea for South Africa, I believe, is that we need negotiation. And that sounds very airy-fairy, but if you look at the fact that we need those skills, we need the capital of people who are doing well in this country. but we don't need it at any price. We need it in a fairer, more inclusive economy. And the only way you can get to that is by negotiating. But let's look at our own society, and let's look at something which has already happened in the society, which we never talk about. We either don't talk about social grants or we're rude about social grants. The reality is that the simple process of putting a couple of $100 in people's pockets every month has made a huge difference to our rural economies. You have people going to supermarkets in rural areas where there was nothing before, and that's just off the back of people using those social grants to participate in the economy. If you go out to those rural areas, you look at the pavements, people are trading on those pavements. So just a simple intervention like that can have a massive effect. If we expanded on that, and we have the resources in this country to do it. The poor, the rich don't have to starve for the poor to increase. We just have to be more balanced.
Well, on the rich side, do we have to increase taxes? That seems to be the talked about global solution when it comes to companies, closing those tax loopholes, making sure that at least companies are paying tax. And what about individuals? Should there be an acceptance that we have to pay more or not in this country where we've got a small tax base
Interestingly,
anyway?
you're quite right. That is the global solution because that's the reality. I think the irony is we're in a very privileged position in this country for a whole lot of reasons historically. Our problem at the moment is not that we need huge sums of money. The problem is that we need to have new thinking on how to deal with that money. So we need ideas on how to make our education system work better. We need ideas on how to make our health system work better. And some of those ideas are working right now. Stellenbosch University has just produced a study which shows that life expectancy in this country has gone up to the levels it was before the AIDS epidemic, simply because the government used a bit of money to supply antiretroviral drugs to people. So there's an example of a very simple intervention which can really make a huge difference. There's a lot we can do in this country without even raising taxes.
Because you want educated people in jobs earning much more than they would get on a social grant. So that is the key, is that correct?
Yes, but we mustn't sneer at social grants, because what people tend to do with social grants is that they use them to participate in the economy. So even if they're only using them to shop at a supermarket, that's participating in the economy. But generally what we find in rural areas is that people use those social grants to start little businesses, to make things, to sell things, etc. And those social grants are off a low base, kick-starting local economies. So I don't think we must be afraid of the idea of simply putting money in people's hands and letting them take the decision about how to spend it.
Explain, you talk about this new thinking that if we don't change things, well, if capitalism itself doesn't self-correct, it's going to implode because the people at the bottom won't be able to spend, presumably because of riots as well. I mean, does all of the new thinking suggest that Marx was maybe right in the first place?
No, not necessarily that Marx was right. I mean, Marx believed that capitalism was doomed. We've seen in the Scandinavian countries, we've seen in parts of the world in the decades after World War II, that capitalism doesn't have to implode. But that will happen if capitalism doesn't, as you correctly say, take the corrective steps. The reason capitalism didn't implode is that it worked out how to look after itself by actually creating decent opportunities for poor people. And that really is the only way to make sure that capitalism
And the third way was also labourers getting shares in the companies they work for and things like that. But I guess that doesn't help us because we've got this unemployment problem.
Sure. Look, there are a range of things you can do. I mean, you don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. It's not social grants or workers on the boards of companies. There are a range of options we can look at, but I think the priority for the society at the moment is for us to recognize that we have this problem, to recognize that we can only get through this problem if people are prepared to negotiate and are prepared to compromise.
Okay, negotiate and you call for more from business. Let's look at a little gesture. The former CEO of PPC cut his salary, wanted to cut the salary of the execs, lift the lower earners. I spoke to PPC later, and it looks like they've backtracked completely and said we can't miss out on talent, so we have to find other ways. Is that a pity? Were those token gestures from highly paid people welcome, do you think?
Yeah, I think they are welcome. I don't think they're token gestures. I mean, they might be just symbolic gestures. And I think this argument about scaring away talent really needs to be looked at. You've got people in this country taking home 600 million rand a year. If they took home 300 million rand a year, their lifestyle would not change at all. Okay, it simply becomes a status thing. It simply becomes a vanity thing. And you may recall that a couple of years ago, an idea was floated that in both government and business, the senior executives should accept a pay freeze for a year, which quite frankly would have not affected any of their incomes and any of their living standards in the long term at all. And that was shot down by people with these same arguments, now you're going to scare away talent, etc. And yet it was the kind of symbolic attitude which would have made a difference to wage negotiations, would have made a difference to our ability to employ people. So yes, we do need gestures like that, and we do need more business people who are prepared to take that sort of leap. And I don't think we'll scare away talent. I think we're more likely to include talent in our companies.
What is government's role in this? Because the one argument is maybe I will give up a portion of my salary, I will pay higher taxes, but I want a really competent state then that will use that money wisely.
Absolutely. Yes, we do need a competent state, but I think once again we have to be realistic. Government should be doing what we pressurize government to do. That's how democracy works. And I think we need to be realistic about what is possible in this society, because given the nature of the problems, given the kind of difficulties which affect government, maybe, for example, we do need to talk a lot more about simply putting cash in people's hands, rather than these big fancy schemes which don't work because government doesn't know how to do it. So I think maybe we find that simple is best. But obviously government has an obligation to make things work. And that example of health that I've just given is an example of one government ministry which is making an effort. We need to make sure that the other government ministries come to the party.
So every intervention can actually work, and it takes intervention. My final question: what do you think if we accelerate 30 years? Do you think people will be looking back and saying the inequality that was allowed in this time was barbaric? Or do you think there's something in us that means that this problem will remain with us forever?
There's always going to be inequality, Frans. I mean, that's a reality. But I think people will look back. You know, we're really in
this. Is this a tipping point, I guess, is what
there will be a tipping point. There is already a tipping point when the governor of the Bank of England and hedge fund managers and advisors to American presidents are saying we can't go on this way. There is a tipping point. And I think that tipping point will lead to serious action to rescue the system and include people. And I think in 20, 30 years' time, people will look back on this period and say, look, this was a period in which people lost their sense of balance, in which they didn't realize that market economies need welfare, need support for the poor to survive. And I think we'll probably look back on this as an unfortunate incident, a period in history in which people didn't learn the lessons from the past. But hopefully we will learn those lessons and we will progress.
Thank you so much for your time. That was political analyst Stephen Friedman.